before the man, there was the silence. It was a special kind of silence, heavy and expensive, the kind that money could buy, but never truly own. It arrived a full 10 minutes before he did, clearing the air in the Sovereign, a restaurant so exclusive it felt less like a place to eat and more like a museum for wealth. The low hum of polite conversation would thin, the clinking of silver on porcelain would soften, and the staff would begin to move with a new, brittle tension. They were preparing for the arrival of Mr. Ishikawa. No one used his first name. No one knew it. He was simply Mr. Ishikawa, a relic from an older, harder world, a man who wore his past like the immaculately tailored black tuxedo that never seemed to crease. He was the father of Run Ishikawa, a name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with the same mixture of fear and respect. But the father was different. He was not the polished, modern threat his son was. He was the source code, the original ghost in the machine, and his displeasure was said to be a thing of quiet, devastating power. Tonight, the silence was thicker than usual. It pressed down on Clara, a 23-year-old waitress whose own life was a universe away from the gilded cage of the Sovereign. She moved through the spaces between tables with a grace born of exhaustion, her mind a frantic ledger of overdue rent, her mother's medical bills, and the gnawing fear that she was one misstep away from ruin. The Sovereign was a lifeline she hated, a place where she was paid to be invisible, to anticipate the needs of people who would never see her as fully human. Her smile was her armor, her efficiency her shield. The manager, a man named Dubois with a spine made of jelly and a voice coated in false deference, had gathered the staff for a pre-shift briefing that was less of a meeting and more of a threat. "He is coming," Dubois had hissed, his eyes darting around as if the name itself could crack the crystal. Table 7. No one approaches unless summoned.
No mistakes. No sudden movements.
We breathe when he allows us to breathe. Clara had listened, her hands clasped behind her back, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had served billionaires who treated her like furniture and celebrities who demanded the impossible, but the legend of Mr. Ishikawa was different. He was a piece of folklore who happened to be real, a man who reputedly hadn't smiled in 30 years and whose quiet disapproval could get a place like this shut down overnight. The doors opened, and the silence solidified. Mr. Ishikawa entered, not with a dramatic flourish, but with an unnerving stillness. He was smaller than the story suggested, his frame compact and wiry within the tuxedo, but he seemed to absorb all the light and sound in the room. His face was a mask of granite, etched with lines that spoke not of laughter or joy, but of immense pressure and profound discipline. His eyes, dark and flat, scanned the room once, dismissing everything in it. He was followed by two younger men in sharp suits who stood by the entrance, like statues, their purpose unambiguous. Dubois practically melted into the floor as he bowed, guiding the old man to the best table, the one overlooking the city lights. Mr. Ishikawa sat, his posture ramrod straight, and placed his hands on the table. He did not look at the menu. He did not look at the water glass being filled. He simply stared out the window, a man entirely encased in his own impenetrable world. And the restaurant held its breath, waiting for a sign. The sign came in the form of a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture from Mr. Ishikawa towards the waitstaff. It was not a beckoning, but a flick of his eyes, a dismissal of the trembling senior waiter who had been assigned to him. Dubois's face went pale. This was a deviation from the script, an unreadable moment of chaos. He scanned his staff, his gaze landing on Clara with a kind of panicked cruelty. She was the newest, the most expendable. If something went wrong, she would be the sacrifice. "You," Dubois mouthed, his finger trembling slightly as he pointed at her. "Go," Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was a punishment, a test designed for her to fail. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to melt into the background, but the thought of her mother's prescription waiting at the pharmacy pushed her forward. She smoothed down her apron, took a deep breath that did little to calm her nerves, and approached the table. The closer she got, the more intense the aura of coldness became. It was a physical presence, a drop in temperature. The two bodyguards at the door watched her every step, their eyes unblinking. She stopped a respectful distance from the table. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "May I get you something to start with?" Mr. Ishikawa did not turn his head. He continued to gaze out at the sprawling metropolis below, a kingdom of light and shadow he had helped build through means both fair and foul. For a full 30 seconds, he said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming thin and sharp. Clara stood her ground, her training kicking in. Do not fidget. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not exist until acknowledged. She could feel the eyes of every staff member and several curious patrons on her back. She was on a stage she never asked to be on, the star of a drama she wanted no part in. Finally, his voice emerged, low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was not a request. It was a command, a single word that dismissed her and her entire profession. "Of course, sir," Clara replied, her voice maintaining its professional calm. "We have a selection of rare, artisanal teas. Our silver needle from Fujian is particularly noteworthy, or perhaps a first flush Darjeeling." He finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers for the first time. They were not angry or cruel, but utterly empty, as if he were looking straight through her at a ghost only he could see. "Just tea," he repeated, the words clipped. "Hot. Black." Nothing else. The finality in his tone was absolute. He was a man who had no time for the flourishes and pretensions of this world. He wanted something simple, something real, and he wanted to be left alone with his memories and his silence. Clara nodded, a small, respectful inclination of her head. Right away, sir, as she turned, she felt a strange sense of pity mixed with her fear. For all his power, for all the terror he inspired, he seemed like the loneliest man on earth, marooned at a table of polished mahogany, surrounded by a city that feared him but could offer him no comfort. She walked back towards the kitchen, acutely aware that this was more than just an order for tea. It was the beginning of something, and she had no idea if she would survive it. Clara prepared the tea herself, bypassing the station waiter. She chose a simple, robust salon, something honest and unpretentious. She selected a heavy, plain ceramic cup, not the delicate, translucent china the restaurant usually used for its high-end teas. It felt right somehow. She felt his eyes on her as she returned, her steps measured and quiet. She placed the small tray on the table, her movements fluid and deliberate, creating no sound. She poured the steaming, dark liquid into the cup, the aroma of the tea rising in a fragrant cloud. He watched her hands, his gaze sharp and focused. As she set the teapot down, she noticed the way he reached for the cup. His fingers, though aged, were long and elegant. He didn't grab the handle. Instead, he cradled the body of the cup with both hands, his thumbs resting on the rim, his palms absorbing the heat. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a way of holding something not for its function, but for its feeling, its warmth. It was a gesture she knew. It reminded her of her grandfather, a carpenter from Alabama, who would come in from his cold workshop and hold his mug of coffee the exact same way, letting the heat seep into his tired, aching hands. He used to say it was the only way to feel the heart of the drink. Without thinking, without filtering the thought through the rigid protocols of her job, Clara spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, not meant for the room, but just for him. "My grandfather used to hold his cup like that," she said. "He said it was the only way to truly feel its warmth, to let it settle you from the inside out." The words were out before she could stop them. A gasp went through her. She had broken the cardinal rule. She had been personal. She had shared a piece of herself with a man who was a fortress. She braced for the explosion, for the cold dismissal, for the gesture that would have Du Bois firing her on the spot. But it didn't come. Instead, an even deeper silence fell over the table, a silence that was different from before. It was not empty, it was full. Full of shock, of memory, of something breaking. Mr. Ishikawa's hands froze around the cup. He did not look at her. He stared down into the dark liquid, as if seeing an entire lifetime reflected in its surface. The granite mask on his face seemed to soften, to crack just a little around the edges. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a legend and more like a man. An old, tired man. He slowly lifted the cup to his lips, his movements still precise but now imbued with a different quality, a sense of ritual. He took a sip, and his eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Clara. The emptiness was gone. In its place was something ancient and sorrowful, a flicker of humanity she never expected to see. He lowered the cup, placing it back on the saucer with a soft click that echoed in the cavernous silence. His gaze remained on Clara, analytical yet strangely vulnerable. It was as if she had spoken a password to a locked room in his soul, a room he himself had forgotten the key to. The simple observation about the teacup had done what legions of deferential subordinates and terrified business partners could not. It had reached him. It had bypassed the armor of wealth and reputation and touched the man underneath. Her words hadn't been flattery. They were a moment of unvarnished, shared human experience. A bridge, impossibly, had been thrown across the chasm that separated them. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice softer now, the gravelly edge slightly smoothed. "He was a wise man." Clara could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. She had expected to be fired, not to be engaged in conversation. From across the room, she could see Du Bois wringing his hands, his face a comical mask of horror and confusion. This was not in the manual. This was an anomaly that threatened the very fabric of his carefully controlled universe. The sommelier, a sharp-eyed woman named Lena, who missed nothing, caught Clara's eye and gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Lena was a veteran of these dining rooms. She understood power, and she had just witnessed a shift in its currents. Mr. Ishikawa took another sip of tea, his eyes still on Clara. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but in this context it was revolutionary. He was asking to see her, to acknowledge her existence beyond her function as a waitress. "Clara," she replied, her voice regaining its strength. "My name is Clara," he repeated it under his breath. Clara, he seemed to test the sound of it, as if it held some special significance. A memory surfaced in his mind, hazy at first, then sharpening into painful focus. A different city, a different lifetime. He was young, desperately poor, a foreigner with nothing but ambition and a gnawing hunger in his belly. A winter night, so cold it felt like glass shards in his lungs. And a woman, a stranger, who had seen him shivering in a doorway and had given him her scarf and a cup of hot, sweet coffee from a thermos, held in just that way. She had been a black woman, her face kind, her eyes full of a gentle pity that held no judgment. He never learned her name. He had fled that city and built an empire, burying that memory of helplessness under layers of steel and success. But Clara's gesture, her simple words, had excavated it in an instant. He looked at her now, and for a moment, he saw the ghost of that long-ago kindness in her face. The debt he never knew how to repay, the one he had tried to forget, was suddenly staring back at him from across a table laden with food he couldn't taste. The atmosphere in the Sovereign had been irrevocably altered. The invisible walls of protocol had been breached. Mr. Ishikawa, the silent titan, was speaking, and he was speaking to a junior waitress. He gestured to the chair opposite him, an invitation so shocking that for a moment, Clara thought she had imagined it. "Sit," he said. It was still a command, but the tone was different. It was the command of a man used to being obeyed, but this time, it was laced with a plea. Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking towards Du Bois, who was now flapping his hands in a silent, frantic display of negation. Sitting with a guest was a fireable offense of the highest order. But then she looked back at Mr. Ishikawa. The loneliness in his eyes was a raw, tangible thing. It was a loneliness that mirrored her own, in a way, the isolation of struggle, his born of too much power, hers of too little. She made a choice. She pulled out the heavy velvet chair and sat down. A collective, inaudible gasp rippled through the restaurant. The other diners, who had been pretending not to watch, were now staring openly. This was better than any theater. Lena, the sommelier, calmly walked to a nearby table and poured a glass of wine, her expression unreadable, but her proximity offered a silent shield. "Tell me about your grandfather," Mr. Ishikawa said, his voice low, intended only for her. And so Clara talked. She spoke of the man who smelled of sawdust and varnish, whose hands were rough but whose heart was gentle. She spoke of his small workshop, the lessons he taught her about patience and integrity, about finding the beauty in the grain of the wood. She wasn't performing. She was simply remembering. She was giving this strange, powerful old man a small piece of her own history, a story that had nothing to do with money or power, and everything to do with love and warmth. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't interrupt. He just absorbed her words, and as she spoke, something remarkable happened. The deep, harsh lines on his face seemed to ease. The impenetrable mask grew more translucent. He was still Mr. Ishikawa, a man capable of immense coldness, but for a few minutes, in the bubble of their conversation, he was also just a man listening to a story, a man remembering what it felt like to be warmed by something other than a teacup. The food he had ordered earlier arrived, an elaborate spread of his favorite dishes, but he waved it away, his attention fixed solely on Clara. He had come here for a familiar ritual of solitude, but had found something he hadn't realized he was starving for, a genuine human connection. The heavy glass doors of the Sovereign swung open with a force that made the crystal glasses tremble. A new presence entered the room, colder and sharper than the one that had preceded it. This was Ren Ishikawa, the sun, the heir. He was the modern embodiment of his father's power, dressed in a European suit that cost more than Clara's annual salary, his hair perfectly styled, his face a handsome, emotionless mask of corporate ruthlessness. Where the father was a creature of silence and memory, the son was a creature of speed and transaction. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who owned every room he entered. His eyes, a colder version of his father's, swept the dining room, instantly assessing and dismissing. Then they landed on table 7. They narrowed. He saw his father, the unapproachable patriarch, leaning forward, engaged in conversation with a waitress. A black waitress. And she was sitting at his table. Ren's mind, which operated purely on calculations of threat and opportunity, processed the scene in a nanosecond. He saw a grifter, a nobody who had somehow gotten her hooks into his venerable and perhaps increasingly senile father. He saw a vulnerability, a weakness in the family's impenetrable facade, and his immediate instinct was to eliminate it. He strode towards the table, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. The 2 bodyguards, who had been standing at ease, snapped to attention at his approach. Dubois saw him coming and scurried over, his face slick with sweat. "Mr. Ishikawa," Dubois began, bowing low. "A pleasure to have you." Ren cut him off with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of such utter contempt that Dubois physically flinched. Ren's attention was entirely on Clara. He stopped beside the table, looking down at her as if she were an insect he had found on his plate. His voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling promise of violence. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, not looking at his father, but directing the full force of his venom at Clara. Clara felt a jolt of pure fear. The warmth of the conversation with the elder Ishikawa vanished, replaced by an arctic cold. This was the man from the whispers, the man who dismantled companies and ruined lives before breakfast. Your father invited me to sit," she said, her voice small but not wavering. Ren let out a soft, humorless laugh. "My father is an old man. He can be impressionable. I'm sure you were very convincing." The insinuation was ugly and clear. He turned to his father, his tone shifting to one of strained patience, the kind one uses with a difficult child. "Father, we should go. Your car is waiting." Mr. Ishikawa, who had been watching his son's arrival with a heavy, disappointed expression, slowly placed his teacup back on its saucer. He did not look intimidated. He looked weary. "I am not ready to leave," he said, his voice regaining some of its former steel. "We're having a conversation." Ren's perfectly composed face tightened. He was not used to being contradicted, especially not by his father in public. He saw this not as a simple disagreement, but as a challenge to his authority, a sign of his father's weakening grip, which he was all too eager to assume. He decided to handle the problem directly. He turned his cold gaze back to Clara. "Your services are no longer required," he said, the words a clear dismissal. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim, platinum money clip, and peeled off several large denomination bills. He tossed them onto the table. "For your time," he added, the insult hanging in the air. He was trying to turn her act of kindness into a transaction, to reduce her back to what he thought she was, someone who could be bought and dismissed. Clara stared at the money.
It was more than she made in a week.
It could pay her rent, and then some. Every practical bone in her body screamed at her to take it, to apologize, to disappear, and live to fight another day. But something else, something she had inherited from the grandfather who smelled of sawdust, held her in her seat. It was a quiet, stubborn dignity. She looked from the money to Ren's contemptuous face, and then to the old man, who was watching this exchange with a profound sadness. "Thank you, sir, but that won't be necessary," Clara said, her voice clear and firm. "I was not sitting here for money." Ren's eyes narrowed into slits. This defiance was unexpected. He was used to people crumbling before his wealth and power. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a request." Just as he spoke, his father moved. It was a small, swift action. Mr. Ishikawa's hand shot out and rested on his son's arm. His grip, for a man his age, was like iron. Ren froze, his eyes wide with surprise. "That is enough, Ren," Mr. Ishikawa said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute weight of command, the voice that had built an empire. It cut through Ren's arrogance like a surgeon's scalpel. "She is my guest," he emphasized the word guest, elevating Clara from a servant to an equal in a single breath. He slowly released his son's arm. "You have forgotten your manners. You have forgotten where you come from." Ren looked at his father, then at Clara, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. He saw the situation as a simple problem to be solved with money and intimidation. He could not comprehend the deeper emotional currents flowing beneath the surface. He was a man who spoke only the language of power, and he was suddenly in a conversation he did not understand. For the first time in his adult life, he was at a loss, publicly checked by the one man he could not bully or buy. The entire restaurant watched, transfixed, as the carefully constructed world of the Ishikawa family began to fracture right before their eyes. Mr. Ishikawa turned his attention away from his stunned son and back to Clara. The brief flash of iron authority in his eyes softened again into that deep, sorrowful contemplation. He was looking at her, but he was seeing a ghost from half a century ago. The narration of his own life was playing out in his mind, a story he had never told anyone, not even his own son. He remembered the shame of his youth, a poverty so absolute it was a physical ache. He had arrived in America with nothing, a boy fleeing a post-war country that had no future for him. He remembered sleeping in alleyways, the gnawing hunger, the brutal indifference of the city. He remembered that one specific night, the temperature dropping below freezing, the wind cutting through his thin coat. He had been huddled in a doorway, convinced he might not see the morning when she appeared. The black woman, her face weary from a long shift of cleaning other people's messes, had stopped. She hadn't said much. She had simply unwrapped the worn woolen scarf from her own neck and wrapped it around his. She had poured him coffee from her thermos into a tin cup, and he remembered holding it just so, with both hands, trying to absorb every last bit of warmth. She had given him the last of her sandwich. She had asked for nothing. When he had tried to thank her, his teeth chattering too much to form the words, she had just smiled a tired, gentle smile and said, "Everyone deserves a little warmth." Then she had walked off into the pre-dawn gloom, and he had never seen her again. That single act of selfless generosity had become the secret foundation of his life. It had given him the strength to survive another day, and another after that. He had clawed his way up, driven by a ferocious ambition to never be that cold or helpless again. He had built his empire on ruthlessness and discipline, burying the memory of the boy in the doorway. He had taught his son the lessons of strength, of control, of never showing weakness. He had given Ren everything he never had: wealth, power, education. But in doing so, he realized with a sudden, crushing clarity, he had failed to pass on the most important lesson of all. The lesson of the scarf. The lesson of the teacup. He had raised a son who could conquer the world, but could not recognize a simple act of human kindness. He had created an heir to his fortune, but not to his soul. Looking at Clara, with her quiet dignity and her story about her grandfather, he felt the weight of that failure. Her simple, uncalculated gesture had held up a mirror to his life, and to the cold, empty man his son had become. The spell of silence was broken by Ren. Humiliated and furious, he decided to reassert his authority in the only way he knew how. He turned to the manager, Du Bois, who was hovering nearby, desperate to be of service. "This woman," Ren said, his voice dripping with ice as he gestured towards Clara, "has been bothering my father. She is unprofessional and disruptive. I want her fired." Now Du Bois's eyes widened. This was the moment he had been both dreading and craving. A direct order from the heir apparent. Pleasing Ren Ishikawa could set him up for life. He turned to Clara, his spine stiffening with borrowed power, his face transforming into a mask of managerial indignation. "Miss," he began, his voice using false regret, "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to collect your things. Your employment here is terminated." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. It was happening. The thing she had feared most. The lifeline was being cut. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. She was being fired for an act of kindness, for being human in a place that demanded she be a machine. She looked at Mr. Ishikawa, expecting to see him retreat back into his shell, to allow his powerful son to handle the situation. But the old man did something no one expected. He stood up. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his full height. He was not a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to tower over everyone in the room. He struck the floor once with the heavy silver-headed cane he rarely used, and the sharp crack silenced every remaining whisper in the restaurant. "No," Mr. Ishikawa said. The word was not loud, but it resonated with an absolute finality that dwarfed his son's blustering. He turned his gaze on Du Bois, and the manager visibly shrank, the artificial authority draining from him like air from a balloon. "This young woman," Mr. Ishikawa continued, his voice clear and carrying through the room, "has shown more grace and decency than anyone I have met in this city for 20 years. She is not fired, then." He turned to his son. The disappointment in his eyes was a terrible thing to behold. "You see a problem to be eliminated," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You see a transaction. You see weakness. But you do not see the person. You see nothing of value." He then looked around the silent, watching room, his gaze sweeping over the wealthy patrons. 50 years ago," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a parable, "I was a boy with nothing, freezing on a street corner. A woman, a stranger, gave me her scarf. She gave me her warmth when she had little herself. She asked for nothing. That kindness is the stone upon which my entire life was built. Everything I have, everything you have," he said, locking eyes with Ren, "grew from that single, unrewarded act." He gestured towards Clara. "Tonight, this young woman offered me a moment of that same warmth. Not for money, not for favor, but because she has a good heart. And you tried to crush it." The public rebuke was devastating. Ren Ishikawa, the untouchable prince of the city, stood there, exposed and diminished in a room full of his peers. His father had not just defended a waitress, he had publicly dismantled the very foundation of Ren's ruthless philosophy. He had held up his son's soul and found it wanting. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of a lifetime of unspoken truths. Ren's face was a pale, rigid mask, his composure finally cracking to reveal the raw humiliation beneath. He looked at his father as if he were a stranger, unable to comprehend this sudden, dramatic transformation. Mr. Ishikawa paid him no more mind. He turned back to Clara, his expression softening once more. He reached into his own tuxedo jacket, but instead of a money clip, he pulled out a simple, elegant checkbook and a fountain pen. He walked over to the maitre d' station, the entire room tracking his movements. He spoke quietly to Du Bois, whose face cycled through a series of emotions from terror to utter disbelief. Then, Mr. Ishikawa began to write. He wrote for a long time, his hand steady. When he was finished, he tore the check from the book with a neat, decisive rip. He walked back to the table and handed it not to Clara, but to the petrified manager. "This restaurant," Mr. Ishikawa announced, his voice calm but unyielding, "is under new management."
Mine.
"And my first act as owner is to appoint a new general manager." He turned and looked directly at Clara, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips for the first time. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice full of a respect that was worth more than any fortune. "The position is yours if you will have it. You will run this place with the same integrity and warmth you have shown tonight. Your salary will be enough to ensure you never have to worry about rent or bills again." The shock in the room was electric. It was a status reversal so complete, so theatrically perfect, that no one could quite believe it. Clara, the expendable waitress, was now the most powerful person in the room besides Ishikawa himself. Du Bois looked as if he were about to faint. Ren stood frozen, a statue of impotent rage. Clara stared at the old man, her mind reeling. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest that she wasn't qualified, that this was impossible, but he simply held up a hand. "My grandfather was a wise man," he said, echoing her earlier words. "He would have wanted you to accept. Wisdom should be in charge. Kindness should be in charge." He then picked up the bills his son had thrown on the table. He walked over to Ren and pressed them into his hand. "You keep this," he said quietly. "Perhaps one day, you will find someone who needs it more than you do, and you will understand." With that, he turned, bowed slightly to Clara, and walked towards the exit, his bodyguards falling into step behind him. He left behind a shattered hierarchy, a redeemed soul, and a young woman whose life had been irrevocably, impossibly changed by a single, quiet word about a teacup.